Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture, our course conclusion discussion on the last two articles by Moraga and Ensaldúa. And I chose these two pieces because I feel they kind of exemplify all the different kinds of themes and topics that we've discussed throughout the semester. So beginning with La Güera by Sherry Moraga, in this piece, Moraga begins by discussing her multiple identities and how her journey towards understanding and navigating her identities has allowed her to gain better understanding, not just of herself, but also of others, and being able to create solidarity with others. She talks about her difficulties in navigating her biracial identity, being both Mexican American and white. She also discusses how this was difficult because of the internalized oppression that existed within her own family, as her mother emphasized the value of her light skin. For her mother, a way to overcome their poverty was to become as anglicized as possible. She also discusses how, because she could pass racially as white, it wasn't until she experienced being othered through her sexuality as a lesbian that she began to fully comprehend what it meant to be othered racially as well. She also begins to see the differences between types of language. The language of her education was an alienating language, while her family language was filled with emotion and allowed her to express those emotions she'd repressed. In this piece, she also talks about the role of fear and oppression. In the first quote here, the danger lies in ranking the oppressions, the danger lies in failing to acknowledge the specificity of the oppression. She talks about the danger of ranking oppressions. In other words, she's critiquing the way that sometimes people get into arguments over which group is more oppressed. Yet she doesn't suggest with her critique that we shouldn't discuss or acknowledge how there are differences in the various forms of oppression. So it's important to also acknowledge the specificity of each type of oppression. And the second quote, she discusses what oppressors fear. He fears he will discover in himself the same aches, the same longings as those of the people he has shedded on. He fears the immobilization threatened by his own incipient guilt. He fears he will have to change his life once he has seen himself in the bodies of the people he has called different. He fears the hatred, anger, and vengeance of those he has hurt. In this quote, she undermines the power of the oppressor by exposing his fears. Fear as being at the root of oppression, not just that he or they might see themselves in those they oppress. And thus their ideas about inherent differences would collapse, but also a fear of what would have to change in their lives in order to make room for the oppressed. Finally, in the last quote, she states, "I can't afford to be afraid of you, nor you of me. If it takes head-on collisions, let's do it. This polite timidity is killing us." In this final quote, she's addressing white women of the mainstream feminist movement in particular, and how their own fears have gotten in the way of creating solidarity across race. In order to reach solidarity, both parties have to get over their fears of what may or may not happen and take the chance anyway. And I think that she's through these quotes really identifying the core difficulties of why race is still an issue in this country, and why it's so difficult for people to have honest conversations with each other about racial differences. In La Prieta by Gloria Ensaldúa, she describes the racialization she experiences as a quote-unquote dirty Mexican, even though her family has been in the US for 6 generations. She describes the contentious relationship with her body because she developed at a very early age, and her periods were extremely painful. As a result, she had to deal with her mother's messages around her body, but also with male white doctors who failed at providing her appropriate medical attention and dismissed her pain. And so this experience that she talks about here recalls our earlier conversations in the class around reproductive health. It recalls the pieces where in the testimonial selections where women talked about how they felt about their bodies. She also discusses the internalized racism and shame she experienced within her family and outside of her family as well, as when she describes being ashamed of her homemade lunches at school. She also discusses the various forms of physical and emotional pain and trauma that she's experienced within and outside of her family because of her gender and sexuality. Finally, she turns to the challenge she's experienced in being a bridge of solidarity to queer and white feminist communities, while at the same time critiquing the ways that communities of color are complicit with racism. When naming her multiple experiences of oppression and abuse, both within and outside of the communities that she identifies with, is always a part of her theory and practice. She also always tries to incorporate a vision towards healing. In this case, she envisions a left-handed world, or el mundo zurdo, as she describes in this quote, the pull between what is and what should be. I believe that by changing ourselves, we change the world. That traveling el mundo zurdo path is the path of a two-way movement, a going deep into the self and expanding out into the world, a simultaneous recreation of the self and a reconstruction of society. And I think this really captures everything that we've talked about this semester, from all the different movements that Latina women have been involved with, from all the different forms of art, documenting our histories, participating in different kinds of organizations, writing testimonios, standing up around reproductive justice. All of these things that we've discussed, I think, really are captured in this quote that is really about how, in changing ourselves from within and healing ourselves, we can change the world. And in recreating ourselves, we can reimagine and reconstruct a kind of society that is more opening, accepting, and affirming of the experiences of Latina women. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to your comments in the discussion posts. Have a great week.